One of the most common critiques in the comments under my videos about the transformation of Eastern Europe to capitalism and the conflict about the domination of Eastern Europe in the future was the term Eastern Europe itself. In those videos, I often speak about countries like Poland, Hungary or Czechia. Why am I using the ugly E word to describe our beautiful Central European countries? Why am I, a local Czech person, ruining the years of hard work that has been done to teach all the Westerners that we are not the poor, grey, homophobic, racist, undemocratic Eastern Europe? But to me, the matter was always more complex than that. People often use geographic arguments like the fact that Prague, an Eastern European city by the Cold War standards, is to the west of Vienna, or that the geographic center of Europe is located somewhere in Poland, Slovakia or Lithuania, allegedly proving the Central European character of the region. But while geographically speaking that is true, Central Europe is mostly a cultural and political construct. It has a geographic element to it, sure. Still, you won't persuade people to rewrite their mental map and start to think about a region differently based on pointing out a geographic reality. Because cultural factors, not geographic ones, influence their mental map. The majority of Sweden, Stockholm included, is located east of the contemporary German-Polish border. Still, no one ever proposes that Sweden is Eastern Europe, because it is culturally quintessential Western country and is perceived as such in people's mental maps worldwide. Eastern Europe is a cultural term and one with a bad reputation. Just think about the first images that come into your head when you hear Eastern Europe. Is it the rich cultural heritage of the many nations inhabiting this neck of the woods and the number of beautiful landscapes and historical sites? Or is it the grey, depressing image of commie blocks, painting a picture of underdeveloped and culturally backward societies? If it is the former, then great. But I believe that it is the latter, if we are honest with each other. I recently saw on YouTube something that illustrates this neatly. I watched a conversation between Tristan Tate, the brother of the infamous Andrew Tate, and some YouTuber from the United States. As some of you likely know, the Tate brothers live in Romania, in Bucharest, I think. The American YouTuber lives in Los Angeles, and Tristan Tate was talking about how life in Eastern Europe is awesome and that the YouTuber should visit them in Romania. The YouTuber declined the offer and justified it by saying that he was scared to visit Eastern Europe. And Tristan Tate was like, dude, you live in fucking Los Angeles. Compare the crime statistics of Los Angeles and Bucharest. It truly is an absurd thing to be afraid of Romania while living in Los Angeles. I have visited both places, and Los Angeles is not a place where you feel particularly safe. Quite the opposite. Whatever you might think about the Tate brothers, and it is completely understandable not to have any fondness for them, in my opinion, they at least deserve recognition for repeatedly conveying to broad audiences that Eastern Europe is not a dangerous place, on average. On the contrary, Eastern European countries are now probably safer than Western European ones. On average, at least those integrated into Western economic and political structures. But in the mental maps of many Westerners, it is not the case. The American YouTuber's case is likely a product of particularly ignorant American approach to the rest of the world. But that Eastern Europe is just not a good brand is a fact. All countries that can brand themselves differently do so without hesitation. Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia and others insist on being Central Europe. Baltic states think of themselves as similar to Scandinavia countries, and thus part of Northern Europe. Some coastal Balkan countries hide within the Southern European brand or use Southeastern Europe. Only the Eastern Slavic nations of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are not disputing their Eastern European nature. At least, I am not aware of it. Despite all the efforts to persuade the world to accept the Central European nature of the post-communist countries, these efforts are ultimately unsuccessful. I am carefully monitoring the usage of the terms when the region is discussed in foreign media, casual discussions on online forums, or just my conversations with people from abroad. I cannot show all the examples from the Western media because of copyright issues. Still, the Western household media like Guardian, New York Times and Financial Times are using the term Eastern Europe almost exclusively when discussing the region, even when speaking about it positively, such as praising its economic development in the last 30 years. I have observed that people mostly use the term Central Europe to be polite toward the people from the region. I, for example, know that when Asian business people want to deal in the region, they are instructed not to call the region Eastern Europe, but Central Europe, not to offend. But even people with deep knowledge about the region and respect for the region use term Eastern Europe. For example, the historian John Connolly, author of an excellent book about the region's modern history, predominantly used the term Eastern Europe. When listening to an interview with American writer and conservative thinker Christopher Caldwell, a man with undeniably deep knowledge of European affairs, he used the term Eastern Europe when debating Hungary. Then he corrected himself. Or Central Europe, how they want to be called now. That hits the nail on the head. That is what we like to be called now, and if the speaker is somehow interested in respecting our wishes, he might use the term Central Europe. But in the mental maps of most people around the world, anything east of Germany is Eastern Europe. When you begin to untangle the issue, you will find out that it is a surprisingly complex matter, with many different angles from which to approach it. So, in this video, I would like to analyze the issue from the historical, economic, social, religious, and civilizational points of view. I say civilizational because I believe that, in the end, the issue is not necessarily about not being perceived as Eastern European for the sake of it, but being perceived as a legitimate member of the Western civilization. The eastern border of Europe is not created by any clear geographic boundary. That is a crucial point to understand, since it means that culturally political criteria had always defined the eastern border of Europe. In antiquity, Europe ended on the river Don, in contemporary southwestern Russia, a definition you could sometimes hear up to the 18th century. During the Middle Ages and early modern period, the terms Europe and the West were used synonymously with the land that adhered to western branches of Christianity. That meant that Polish and Hungarian states were the eastern edges of Europe and the West. Thus, at the time, Poland and Hungary were Eastern Europe. The view that Europe extended as far as the sword of the Polish and Hungarian king reached was called Antemurale Christianitatis, or the bulwark of Christianity, in the official church conceptions, and also included Spain or southern Italy. Basically, the cultural borderlands of Western Christendom with Orthodoxy and Islam. Russians were not included among Europeans back then, and were viewed similarly to Tatars or Turks, and the concept of Europe reaching the Ural Mountains was completely unheard of. Brabantian cartographer, geographer, and cosmographer Abraham Ortelius placed the border between Asia and Europe approximately to the middle of contemporary Ukraine in the 16th century. In the following centuries, the Russian state expanded into a Eurasian empire. It chose the Ural Mountains as an internal sacral border, dividing Europe from Asia and acting as a symbol of the Eurasian character of the Russian civilization. This dividing point, the Ural Mountains, was accepted by the French and English cartographers from the beginning of the 19th century and became burned into the mental maps of people and the geographic textbooks. That is very relevant for the debate about Central Europe, because if Russia is now Europe and Europe reaches so far to the east, what previously might be considered Eastern Europe might suddenly be something else. Similar debates were happening regarding the southeastern border of Europe in the Balkans, since the term Balkans itself was often used as a defamatory term to de-Europeanize the nations of the Balkans in an Orientalist way. During the Enlightenment period, the new division of Europe into the Western and Eastern was slowly starting to push out the old North-South division and becoming the predominant way of perceiving the continent in the eyes of English and French intellectuals. The West was, in their minds, defined as the land formed by Latin Christianity, Roman law, and antique philosophy. To the east and southeast lay two Orientalist states, Ottoman Empire and Russian Empire. The majority of Slavic inhabitants with predominantly Orthodox faith were seen as a sign of these Orientalized European borderlands. English cartographers labeled the Ottoman Balkans as the Near East in the 19th century. On the border between the West and the rest lay the Habsburg Empire, partially stemming from the Holy Roman Empire Italian, Austrian, and Czech lands, and adjacent Hungarian and Croatian lands and Transylvania. With time, the Austrian Empire expanded into the Orient land of the times in Galicia, Bukovina, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. During the 19th century, Central Europe, also began appearing in various diplomatic and intellectual texts. At the beginning of the 19th century, the term usually included Prussian and Habsburg states. The term began to be used rather frequently during the Vienna Congress from 1814 to 1815. It was used to describe the space between France and Russia, but especially contemporary Germany and Benelux. In the view of the French and English diplomats of the time, even Prussia was perceived as an Eastern power. But the term Central Europe was used more to describe the political architecture of certain geographic spaces than to name a distinct cultural region, as today. In the minds of the Western European intellectuals and authors of the 19th century, contemporary Eastern Europe was perceived as a mysterious edge of Europe and place standing in opposition to the civilization and rationality of the West. At the beginning of the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, the hero crosses the bridge over the Danube in Budapest and writes in his diary, quote, "The impression I had was that we were leaving the West and entering the East. The most western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule." End of quote. Poland and Hungary, but sometimes also Austria and Czech lands, were perceived as a periphery of European civilization. Parisian intellectuals often perceived Persia or Russia as being closer to them, mostly due to lack of real knowledge about the places. Austrian statesmen of the time, Clemens von Metternich, ironically said that Asia begins on the outskirts of Vienna in 1820, and at another time labeled the border between Austrian and Hungarian parts of the monarchy as the border between Europe and Asia. The well-known term Mitteleuropa was meant to describe the space dominated by German Empire and the German people. While it included most of current Central Europe, it is problematic, since it is not clear if the region would be perceived as Mitteleuropa if not dominated and civilized by the German Herrenvolk. During the interwar period, the belt of states between France and the USSR, so Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Switzerland, was coined as Central Europe by the French geographer Emmanuel de Martonne, but the term was used more in a geographic than political or cultural way. After the World War II, the Iron Curtain divided Europe, and the West-East dichotomy likely reached its pinnacle. The Soviet Empire and its satellites were seen as the Eastern Bloc, including even what was left of former Prussia in the form of GDR. The legendary first German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, was allegedly glad that the post-war West Germany did not include the lands east of Elbe, since he considered it a backwater. He often uttered Asia, again, in annoyance and a condescending tone when crossing the Elbe in the eastern direction. During the Cold War, the term Central Europe was mostly being kept alive by authors connected to the region somehow. For example, Polish-American historian Oskar Halecki, who even divided the region into the West Central and East Central Europe. Or Czech novelist Miloš Kundera with his essay on the subject of the tragedy of Central Europe, which he perceived as a part of the Western civilization kidnapped into the East. After the end of the Cold War, the Central European character became one of the cornerstones of the identity of the inhabitants, and it reached a point in which you could almost get into a fight in a pub over the subject if you said to the wrong person he is Eastern European. As you can see, the issue is not as straightforward as it sometimes might seem. The concept of Central Europe is relatively new from the historical perspective, and it is thus not entirely fair to declare the Central European status as some scientific historical truth. As I see it, the issue stems from the fact that there are two division lines within Europe that are both about 1,000 years old. The first division is based on the extent of the Carolingian Empire in its most extensive form in 813. The empire's eastern border at the time is surprisingly consistent with Europe's Cold War continental division. It basically copies the border between the communist and capitalist worlds, with the exception of Slovenia, the Croatian region of Istria, and the westernmost part of Bohemia. But apart from that, it is a remarkable similarity. To the east of the border of the Frankish Empire lie the tributary territories of predominantly Slavic tribes adjacent to this eastern border, mostly tribal federations that would later produce the early Czech, Croatian, and Polish states. There is a feeling of the cultural superiority of people on the western side of this border towards the people on the eastern side that never really disappeared. The reason it never really disappeared is that it does not contain just cultural elements caused by the fact that in the times of the Frankish Empire, the Western Slavs were mostly pagan tribal federations, while the peoples of the Frankish Empire were already Christianized and also culturally shaped by the heritage of Roman Empire. That was undoubtedly true, but that could be changed by the westernization process in those territories during the following centuries. The reason for the persistence of this ancient division line is that it is also an ethnic divide between the world of Germanic and Latin peoples and that of the Slavs. Many Westerners would probably decline this claim, because it is politically incorrect to suggest so in the contemporary atmosphere of seemingly non-existent ethnic differences. Still, Slavic peoples were never wholly accepted as Western, even after millenniums of heavy Western cultural influence. It is also why Western Europe found it very easy to internalize the Cold War West-East dichotomy, and why the proper Europe still kind of ends on this border in the mental maps of many people worldwide. If we accept the thesis that German and Latin ethnicity is one of the prerequisites of true belonging to Western civilization, it opens other, not often asked questions. The term Central Europe in the 19th and early 20th century was connected to the space dominated by German powers of Prussia and later the German Empire and the German-ruled Austria. But Germans also colonized the lands for hundreds of years, and there were millions of ethnic Germans living in what is now considered Central and Eastern Europe. The Sudetenland, basically the whole western part of contemporary Poland, the contemporary Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, Transylvania, as well as many cities like Budapest, Tallinn, Riga or Bratislava, had either an outright German majority or at least very significant German-speaking minority until the World War II. If you were to visit Prague or Brno in 1800, it was primarily German cities. Slovaks consisted 15% of the population of Bratislava, the capital city of Slovakia, in 1910, while German speakers 42%. If you were a British or a French traveler in the 19th century and you visited Prague, Breslau, Danzig or Kronstadt, you would visit cities where you could get by with speaking German and architecture similar to Saxony or Bavaria. You would feel you were in a reasonably culturally familiar place, even though clearly distinct from the imperial centers of London or Paris. Would you feel the same in some Polish or Slovak village couple of hundreds of kilometers to the east? While this won't sit right with many of my viewers from the region, it is a fact that many of the architectonically iconic city centers in the area were built and primarily inhabited by Germans. When the thousand-year-long ethnic presence of Germans in Eastern Europe ended after World War II, the region inevitably lost some of its Western character, at least in the eyes of the Westerners. The second crucial division within Europe mostly correlates with the divide between the Western and Eastern Church. That is the old civilizational border between Western and Orthodox civilization, as it is most commonly perceived. It is also the border between the universal use of the Latin alphabet and variations of the Cyrillic alphabet, except for Romania, which uses the Latin alphabet. And, again, except for Romania, and this time also Bulgaria and Greece, this border also correlates with the current eastern edge of the European Union. That is the definition used in the most broadly accepted definitions of Western civilization. For example, from the famous Clash of Civilizations book by Samuel Huntington. As I talked about in the previous chapters, lands beyond this border are what I called undeniably Eastern European, which is the lands with Slavic, Orthodox and Cyrillic writing populations, and also a lot of territories that were never really thought of as Europe until relatively recently. These two divides are clearly visible when you look at the nominal GDP per capita or wages in Europe. The first significant drop is in the divide between Germany, Austria and Italy, with Poland, Czechia, Hungary and Slovenia. This is the Carolinian, German/Latin and Slavic border and the Cold War border. The nominal GDP per capita usually halves on this division line. You might argue that Slovenia has almost the same GDP per capita as Italy, but that is skewed because southern Italy is much poorer than northern Italy. If you compare the difference between Slovenia and the Italian provinces it borders, the difference is much more significant. I will come back to the Italian north-south divide later. A similar drop happens once you reach the Western Orthodox border, with the exception of Romania and Greece. To address these exceptions, Greece is culturally a very specific country that, while historically a quintessentially Orthodox country, is also the most maritime Orthodox nation, and that always incentivized trade and wealth creation. Greece is also historically more connected to the Western civilization through its antique heritage and was never under communist rule, which justifies its relative wealth growth compared to other Orthodox nations. Romania is doing very well economically, with nominal GDP per capita closer to Visegrad countries than to Ukraine or Moldova, which likely has a variety of historical and geographic reasons. In the eyes of most people from the region, Central Europe encompasses the post-communist Europe that was historically adherent to Western civilization. If we perceive Europe as a geographic entity spanning from the Atlantic to the Urals, it makes sense to recognize these two divisions and use the term Central Europe. But it is also essential to recognize the context of the debate. As I already mentioned, the fact that Europe does not have any clear geographic border on its eastern side means that its eastern edge was often politically and culturally demarcated. Today, it is common to say Europe in a discussion and mean by that the European Union and Western non-EU states like Norway, Switzerland and the UK. While it is, to a certain extent, unfair to European nations outside this system, it is just convenient, since a large part of the continent is intertwined by a common political system. In a way, it is similar to the times when adherence to Western Christianity defined Europe and its borders. In this context, it is logical to perceive the Eastern EU members as Eastern Europe, because they are on the eastern edge of the current European political system. And, once again, it is similar to the times when Europe and the West ended on the eastern border of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Hungarian Kingdom. The centrality of this part of Europe was created by the inclusion of Russia into Europe. That created both the geographic deepness of the European East and the need of the nations between Germany and Russia to distinguish themselves from what they perceive as Russian Oriental despotism. Russia forced itself into Europe from the 18th century onwards and became an essential part of the European great power security architecture, the so-called Concert of Europe. But this age might be over. Russia is pulling itself out of the European space, increasingly presenting itself not as one of the, even if culturally unique, European powers, as in the 18th and 19th centuries, but as its own Eurasian civilizational space. Even though the geography textbooks are likely not to be overwritten anytime soon, the economic, political and cultural ties between Russia and Europe are breaking up in a significant way. The war in Ukraine is, among other things, an attempt of the Ukrainian state to belong to Europe in a broader civilizational sense, and not to the Russian world. Maybe we are once again reaching times when eastern edge of Europe will be the eastern border of some new Polish-Ukrainian political entity. The sensitivity of the labeling as either Central or Eastern Europe ultimately stems from the need to distinguish our nations from Russia and the inner insecurity of our civilizational belonging. The need to distinguish ourselves from Russia was more or less successful. Sure, you will always find people ignorant about the world who might not see the differences, but most acknowledge that Poland or Czechia are distinctly different from Russia. But now, I want to discuss the second reason, the insecurity regarding our belonging to Western civilization. In Czech public discourse, the phrase "we belong to the West" is so overused by politicians and journalists that nobody seems to know what it really means, apart from our membership in the EU and NATO. It is as if the constant need to remind ourselves of our civilizational belonging to the mighty Western civilization, associated with economic development and democratic leadership, gives away our fundamental uncertainty. People love to stress our similarities with Austria or Bavaria and our differences from Poland or Hungary. One would sometimes come under the impression that it is some historical mistake we are not speaking German. It is especially strange since the leitmotif of our modern history has undeniably been a national struggle to resent political and cultural German domination. So how it is? Is Central and Eastern Europe part of the Western civilization or not? If we use the classic definition I outlined above, it sure is. Parts of Europe adherent to the Western branches of Christianity are parts of the West. But there is another way of dividing the continent, which is less focused on the formal cultural characteristics and more on the actual social structure and psychological makeup of the populations. In 1784, Count de Ségur, a hero of the American Revolution, traveled across Eastern Europe to serve as the French ambassador to the court of St. Petersburg. Having left Prussia and entered Poland, he declared in a statement characteristic of his contemporaries that, quote, he he had moved back 10 centuries and had left Europe entirely. American adventurer John Ledyard, who had traveled with Captain Cook and in 1788 was returning east to west from a solitary expedition to Siberia, reported that he had not reached Europe until he was in Prussia. These western travelers indeed considered Poland of the time to be Eastern Europe. How could they feel like they were in the West when the urban, developed and literate society they were accustomed to was replaced by the mud roads and the dirt-poor villages full of mostly illiterate Polish serfs? What difference did it make to them that there was a Catholic church in this village? There has been a massive social revolution slowly brewing under the lid in northwestern Europe throughout the centuries that finally blew up in the form of the Industrial Revolution that transported part of the continent hundreds of years into the future relative to the rest of the world. This revolution included broad literacy, urbanization, replacement of serfdom with wage labor, increased social mobility, expansion of rights and freedoms of citizens, growing elements of representative government, high levels of impersonal trust that are responsible for well-functioning institutions and low levels of corruption, and large and influential capitalist urban bourgeoisie. Once again, this won't sit right with some people, but one can argue that these attributes are the most significant indicator of the Western belonging of a country. For example, it is usually disputed if Latin America is part of the Western civilization. Why wouldn't it be? It is overwhelmingly Catholic, and the countries in the southern cone are also ethnically almost entirely European. When their Western character is disputed, people usually argue with vastly different social structures stemming from the large agrarian feudal estates of the Spanish Latin American colonies. So different from the small, independent farmers of the North American colonies. But if we were to judge based on these criteria, so the historical social structures, we would inevitably conclude that the social structure of Central and Eastern Europe in the modern period was closer to Latin America than to Britain or the Netherlands. While the classic medieval serfdom was slowly disintegrating in Western Europe throughout the centuries, the opposite process occurred in the East. From the 16th to the 17th centuries, peasants in Poland, Lithuanian Commonwealth, Hungary, Bohemia and partially Prussia were gradually subjugated to their landlords. This system, in which the peasants were bound to work the land for their landlords, instead of competing for jobs on the forming labor market, was probably the most significant diverging point in the fortunes of the different parts of the continent. The massive rise in urbanization occurred in the West, and the ground was preparing for the following industrial and scientific breakthroughs. Why this societal and later economic and scientific revolution happened in northwestern Europe is a subject about which tens of books were written and tens of theories were thought of. Geographic, psychological, religious, or demographic factors are often brought up as the reason for this development, and it would be out of the scope of this video to describe all these theories and their pros and cons. But the fact remains that somewhere around the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was firmly divided between territories forming an economic core, where the manufacturing of high value-added products took place, and an economic periphery that remained overwhelmingly agrarian, was defined by the large landed properties and latifundia, and economically lived off agricultural products and natural resources being sold to the West. Once again, this core part of Europe correlates nicely with the Carolingian Empire established 1,000 years earlier, plus Britain and Scandinavia. In opposition to that, the majority of Spain, southern Italy, and much of Central and Eastern Europe remained agrarian and comparatively poor, with corresponding social structures where the majority of people were rural peasants, and the urban middle classes were relatively small fractions of the population. When the Western status of East European countries is discussed, the undeniable cultural influence of the West on Central and Eastern Europe is often brought up. The art of the Renaissance and ideas of the Enlightenment were of great interest to the noblemen, and the nations produced their fair share of art and architecture inspired by Italian art styles. The aristocrats fashionably spoke German or French, and their children studied at prestigious French, Italian or English universities. But the problem is that this Western influence was often very shallow, reaching the aristocratic, land-owning elites, but not penetrating the wide swathes of the society as in the West, Catholic or Orthodox. The life of peasants in Hungary, Slovakia or Poland in the 18th century was more like the life of Russian peasants than that of the Dutch or British ones. There, of course, was variety. Czech lands started to industrialize earlier and were better off economically with a significantly more westernized social structure. including almost universal literacy and higher urbanization rates before the World War I. One of the common myths that Czech people like to think about themselves is that during the interwar period, Czechoslovakia was among the most developed countries in the world, and only the communism put us in our contemporary subpar position. But that is only partially true. The comparison from 1929 shows that we were the wealthiest Eastern European state and roughly on the level of Italy, but still significantly lagging behind the Northwestern European core. So, not that different in comparison with today. Our better relative position in the world back then was thus caused mainly by the contemporary increased non-European competition in the form of states like Israel or South Korea. When one examines the economic indicators of contemporary Europe, there is a clear trend of the Eastern European EU members' economic rise after the retardation of the communist period ended. Today, Eastern and Southern Europe are increasingly converging in economic terms, but both groups, Southern and Eastern, are not getting close to the convergence with the Northwestern European economic center, which forms, together with the Anglosphere, the true undeniable core of the Western civilization in its modern form. Are the parts of Europe that adhere to Western Christianity without having the critical societal undercurrents ultimately also as Western as the rest? Or are they merely the most thoroughly westernized parts of the non-Western world? I do not have a definitive answer. The Italian case is especially interesting, since while northern Italy is undeniably part of the Western economic and Carolinian core, southern Italy has been a relative periphery since the fall of the Roman Empire. The popular northern Italian saying that Africa begins at Rome is eerily like Konrad Adenauer's and Clement von Metternich's comparisons of the lands east of Elbe and east of Vienna to Asia, which I mentioned earlier. So, I probably did not make the issue any clearer than before, but it indeed is a complex matter. I have a problem with the most often used definition of Central Europe, which includes German-speaking Europe and the Visegrad countries. Such a definition is clearly a remnant of the times when Germans controlled the geographic space, and it does not make a whole lot of sense today. What does Switzerland have in common with Poland or Slovakia? There is a strong case for Austria and parts of Germany, most notably the lands east of Elbe that used to be Prussia historically. But the western parts of Germany, adjacent to the Rhine, are entirely different cultural and historical spaces, a difference acknowledged by the Germans themselves, as we can observe in Konrad Adenauer's condescending remark about Asia. It is also relatively unpractical to use the term Central Europe in this sense when speaking about something other than geographic reality, since Germany and the Visegrad countries differ dramatically in most of the contemporary cleavages that moves European politics. The matter is further complicated by the fact that the current borders of states of the Northern European plain are entirely different than throughout the history of the modern period. The German Empire was unified under Prussian rule in 1871, and this power, which could very well be called Central European, thus managed to use the economic potential of the German industrial heartlands along the Rhine for its expansive eastern endeavors. Today, the tables turned, and the remnants of historical Prussia in the form of communist GDR were swallowed by the undeniably economically and culturally dominant West Germany. This process made Germany essentially a Western European country, even though economically integrated with its eastern periphery. On the other hand, Poland got control over territory inhabited and controlled dominantly by Germans for hundreds of years. Still, this territory was then populated primarily by the Poles expelled from the Kresy, or the eastern borderlands of the interwar Polish Republic, land that today is Lithuanian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian. Those were the easternmost Polish populations, and while they then populated Central European lands, they were coming from an environment that was very Eastern European in nature, being under the control of the Russian Empire for hundreds of years, and thus excluded from many westernizing societal impulses that populations in Austrian and Prussian parts of Poland might experience. Nevertheless, the two primary inter-European divisions are still present as one goes from the west to the east. The first is on the border of Germany, Austria and Italy, with Poland, Czechia, Slovakia and Hungary. The second divide is on the border between the worlds of Latin Christianity and Orthodox Christianity. Both boundaries are still relevant today. The first marks the age-old eastern edge of the core Western Carolinian lands, and the second marks the end of the Western civilization in its classic definition, and largely the contemporary EU eastern border. In between lies the Western Slavic, Hungarian and Baltic nations that, even though heavily westernized throughout history, were never wholly accepted to the Western core and remained a civilizational borderland of a kind to this day. That is Central Europe. We cling on to the term because we love to reassure ourselves of our Western affiliation. Still, I believe that the often salty insistence on being called Central European often reeks of insecurity and an inferiority complex. I do not deny the term its historical validity, but there are also clear historical, ethnic and societal reasons for the persistence of hard, mental Cold War border in Westerners' minds, and also in our minds. This might be subjective, but I still perceive the Czech-Western border with what I see as the West as a significant mental and cultural barrier. So, I'm an Eastern European, loud and proud. And then there is Finland, which genuinely managed to escape from Eastern Europe. Good for you guys.